Hello, everybody. My name is Gabe D'Antonio. I debated policy debate at Ladue High School for 4 years, and today I'm going to talk about stock issues. We're going to start with two relatively unimportant ones. First, harms. Harms asks, what is the problem that you want to solve with your affirmative? And you very rarely see this in apps anymore. In fact, it's often replaced by the impacts on an advantage. So don't freak out if you see someone reading harms. Just treat it how you would treat any other impact. Ask, are they actually able to fix this problem? But generally, you're not going to need to run harms in your 1ACs. You're not going to need to worry about it. Next is significance. Very similar to harms. It asks, why is this problem worth addressing? Again, it's not often run. It's replaced by impacts, and more specifically by impact calculus. Generally, when we're asking ourselves the question, why is X or Y problem worth addressing? We're doing it in the context of impact comparison. You can check out some of our other lectures in order to understand more about impact comparison. But similar to harms, you do not need to run a significance contention in modern day Eastern Missouri affirmatives. Next, inherency, asking what is preventing the problem from being solved. So sort of the original ideas around inherency is that you don't want to essentially be able to advocate for something that's already happening in the status quo, because then the negative team isn't going to be adequately able to contest it, right? If the federal government is already increasing STEM funding and you say, I want to increase STEM funding with my affirmative, most of the disadvantages, you could say that people are going to be angry about increases to STEM funding. Those are all going to be non-unique because of the fact that the government is already increasing it, right? The reason you essentially don't want inherency then is because there needs to be an actual difference between the affirmative and negative advocacies. So if the affirmative thing is happening in the status quo, there's not really a difference in their advocacies. So you need to prove that your advocacy, your affirmative, is not happening. Your problem is not being solved in the status quo. And because of that, we come up with different barriers, inherent barriers. If anybody asks you, what's your inherent barrier? This is what they're talking about. It's what is preventing the app from being passed / the problem from being solved. An example is an attitudinal barrier, saying that people in power don't want to solve the problem. For example, one that we used on the criminal justice topic, we could say that the Trump administration doesn't want to eliminate mandatory minimums, so they're not going to. Now, this will generally work out pretty well for you. If you have like one good inherency card in your 1AC, people often won't contest it. One of the few times they will is say, this is our evidence and Biden just won the election and we haven't updated it yet. Maybe they'll say, okay, Biden actually will eliminate mandatory minimums. Your affirmative is going to happen in the status quo. So just be conscious of that, update them when new elections happen. And then the second main type of inherent barrier is a structural barrier, saying that there are laws or rules that are preventing the problem from being solved. For example, you could say the Department of Justice regulations advise prosecutors to sentence people using mandatory minimums. That's a law that currently creates mandatory minimums that as long as that exists, we're not going to see change in the status quo. That's why we need an affirmative plan. Generally, inherency is not going to be too big of an issue. I think in all of my 4 years, I've only run inherency maybe 3 times, and most of those times were just to prove that I could. If you're really interested in inherency, go ahead and read Bates 95. It's like an old journal article about inherency, and you can read all about that and get super good at it. But honestly, it's not worth your time. Most of the time, it does not matter in the slightest. Next, solvency. It asks, how does your plan work? Now, this is certainly the most important one of the stock issues. It comes up in practically every round. And there are a couple of things that you need in your 1AC to make sure that you've got this stock issue down pat. First, you want to make sure you have a solvency advocate that is advocating specifically for your plan, which means a specific actor and a specific action. The specific actor is like, Congress should, or the Supreme Court should, or the executive branch should, or just the United States federal government should. And then a specific action means it's not just, eliminate mandatory minimums, but it can be just eliminate mandatory minimums, but it could be, update the legal code in this way, or advise prosecutors to not use mandatory minimums. Essentially, you want your solvency advocate to be as specific as possible because it, one, lets you respond really well to critics and different arguments. You can say, that doesn't apply to my specific version, or, you can prefer our author, their specific advocacy. Generally, if there's a trusted source who's advocating for exactly what you're advocating for, it gives you that nice ethos bump. Beyond your solvency advocate, use additional evidence as necessary to fully answer the question, how does your plan work? This is especially important if your solvency advocate is bad. You can sort of Frankenstein one together with multiple pieces of solvency evidence. And often the solvency evidence is really important, not only for answering the potential attacks on solvency, but for dealing with a lot of different types of counterplans. If you look at something like an actor counterplan, where they're going to try to replace Congress with the Supreme Court or something like that, if your advocate is specific to why Congress needs to take action, then you're going to have a better time answering that Supreme Court argument than if it was just talking about something non-specific or an action that needs to be happened and it doesn't matter who does it. Or if it just says, Congress needs to take action on mandatory minimums, and they bring up a pick that explains a different way for Congress to take action, well, you're going to have a hard time answering that if you don't have any solvency evidence explaining why yours is the best way of solving the problem and making sure your plan works. The final stock issue is topicality. It asks, does your plan fall within the resolution? Generally, this is not going to be a contention in the 1AC, but you should have prepared 2AC blocks for a variety of definitions to answer potential T arguments. So we have other lectures on topicality to look into that, but it's important to understand topicality and understand what your argument is for why your app is topical. If I say any word in the resolution, you should be able to explain why that word is not an issue for your affirmative. So topicality, super important. Go ahead and watch Will's lecture on topicality. That'll help you out a lot. I hope this brief primer, on stock issues was helpful, and good luck in your debates.